This evening, of course, our topic is the future of the European Union and transatlantic relations, which always does bring a laughter of a kind, because in 8 days, we'll learn a lot more about the future of the European Union. And I don't know what goes through the minds of Europeans when they contemplate American democracy in 2016. In fact, I don't know what goes through the minds of any of us as we do that. We will trust to the resilience of our body politic. The topic tonight, though, is interesting even beyond Brexit and the question of the exit of Great Britain. And the Europeans just have a lot on their plates. They do have to worry about, to a certain extent, about Mr. Putin's limited imperialism, and of course the shape of their own economy. And they have their own troubles of North versus South, as some Americans think we do. In short, the questions are huge, and they're important to us as Americans because we do think of Europe as the fountainhead of our own civilization, and Europe as a set of great partners in a variety of things which we try to do, which we think are decent enough in global affairs. But what's much more interesting than any comment I would make are the comments of our guests tonight. We're absolutely fortunate to be joined by the ambassador of the European Union to the United States. He's had a marvelous and interesting career within the European Commission especially. He's a graduate of Trinity College in Dublin, from which he was later given an honorary doctorate in respect for the career which he's had. He did graduate work at the College of Europe in Bruges, which also at one time gave him the Alumnus of the Year award. So his basic educational institutions think well of what he has done. His career began, his professional career, as a member of the Irish Foreign Service, which he was in for 4 years, and he joined the European Commission in 1979. He's held interesting posts in what seems to me to be every aspect of social policy within the Union. And he was elevated to the position of Secretary General of the Commission, which is the executive branch, of course, in a sense, of the Union, elevated to Secretary General of the Commission. He later served as the Director General for Trade, and then as Director General for External Affairs, and during which time he was the major figure in organizing the present Foreign Service of the Commission, and he served as its CEO for 3 years. And he's bringing that enormous experience, both in many facets of the European Commission and especially its foreign affairs side in the recent part of his career, to us this evening. So it's an enormous pleasure for me to present to you the Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Ambassador David O'Sullivan.
Well, Dr. Bert Frank, thank you very much indeed for those warm words of welcome. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to meet with you this evening in the wonderful city of Baltimore, which I'm informed has its origins in the words, the Irish words, Bolia Timur, the city of the big house. And in this splendid setting with such a magnificent view out over your city. I have to say, to my great disgrace, I've lived for 18 months in Washington, and this is my Washington, D.C., and this is my first occasion to visit Baltimore. So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to you for having afforded me the opportunity to rectify that most regrettable omission in my travel itinerary. And I can assure you I will be back, because what I've been able to see of the city has really impressed me. And thank you very much for this opportunity. As you said, the title is The Future of the EU and Transatlantic Relations. Well, no pressure there. the Danish physicist Niels Bohr famously said once, prediction is notoriously hazardous, especially when it comes to the future. So I'm not entirely sure where that leaves me, but I want to mention two things that I'm going to disappoint you by not talking about. So just to get the ground rules clear, while I don't let my watch fall off the edge of the podium. There are two things going on which are extremely important, but which I'm really not in a position to say much about. I mean, one is the fact that you're having elections, I have noticed, which are of huge consequence for you, but frankly also of huge consequence for the rest of us. But as you'll understand, as a foreign diplomat accredited in Washington, it's not appropriate for me to engage in any commentary on domestic U.S. politics. I know, I realize I can already see some of you leaving. And the only thing I can say is I hope that when you make your choice in November, that you will choose wisely. Before the rest of you leave, I want to just say that I'm not going to, neither am I going to say anything about the British referendum. Not because I don't hold views on it, and I do, and I'm not ashamed to give my views, but because my views are pretty much irrelevant to the debate which is going on in the UK. This is ultimately a matter for the British people. It's their debate. It's their future. It will also have consequences for the rest of us, but at the end of the day, we have to leave it to their democratic decision. We will see where the result comes out. Personally, I note what's being said in the polls, but I will believe the result when the last vote is counted, because I think the polls have been notoriously unpredictable one way or another. But my only comment is to say that I hope that the British people will also choose wisely next week. But we will wait to see. What I will say, linking both events, but trying to remain, without interfering in either of the domestic debates which these two events involve, is I do observe that we have a problem, a common problem across the Atlantic of politics, which manifests itself in different ways on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think I was discussing with Frank earlier, we have common problems. I mean, we pride ourselves on our common values: democracy, human rights, rule of law, market economy. These are the values which unite us and which have enabled us to build strong and prosperous and relatively socially equitable societies, not without their flaws, not without their weaknesses, but an unprecedented degree of prosperity and social justice on both sides of the Atlantic, probably, frankly, never seen in the history of mankind. And yet, there is disillusion, and there is anger, and there is frustration. And what strikes me in both your election process and in the British debate is the fact that, frankly, facts don't always count for very much. Facts, analysis, objectivity, these seem to play a lesser role sometimes than people's emotions and people's feelings, which we should not discard, but which changes the nature of the political discourse. And I think we have to address this challenge, but we also have to recognize it, because when I'm going to talk about the future of Europe, one of the things is, of course, the rise of populism, the rise of nationalism, a disillusionment with the political elite, a distrust of the political establishment, therefore a turn to other policies, other parties who may not have particularly coherent political agendas, but who attract people by virtue of what they're not. They're not the mainstream. They're not the people who got us into the situation in which we now find ourselves. And this is very much the case for the European Union. I mean, I think the European Union is one of the great success stories of the last 60 years. When you look at what we have achieved based on the rubble of 2 world wars and the Holocaust in 1945, I was very honored 2 weeks ago to attend the D-Day commemoration at the Second World War Memorial in Washington, where I was asked to lay a wreath on behalf of the European Union in tribute to the Americans who gave their lives in that great conflict to liberate the European continent and to provide us with the liberty and the opportunity to build a new Europe. And I made the point that I believe we have not squandered their sacrifice, that what we have achieved in the last 60 or 70 years on the back of that moment is to build a Europe of unparalleled prosperity and freedom and social justice. There is not one country that has joined the European Union that is not far better off now than it ever was before it joined the European Union. The European Union is one of the largest economies in the world. I lose track as to whether it's the Chinese or the US or the EU. Depending on exchange rates, it goes up and down. We're the largest consumer market in the world. We're the largest trading bloc in the world. And we have an unparalleled quality of life. Even one of our greatest challenges, which I'll come back to in a moment, the refugee crisis, is to a certain extent we're victims of our own success. Why do people want to come to Europe? Because it offers an unparalleled quality of life and opportunity which is not available in most of our neighboring countries. We have brought peace and reconciliation to the continent. War between the nation states of Europe is now inconceivable, but something that was very much a risk back in 1945. We have proven a refuge and a haven for countries emerging from totalitarianism. We provided the path back to democracy for Greece in 1981, for Spain and Portugal in 1985, and of course we had the historic reunification of the country when we opened our doors to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe in 2004, and subsequently with Poland and Romania, and then Poland with Bulgaria and Romania, and then Croatia, which is why we now are 28 member states, of whom 13 were former members of the Soviet bloc. I don't believe that the European Union can claim credit for the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I do believe that the European Union and its institutions can claim enormous credit for having meant that that process following the collapse of the wall did not result and deteriorate and degenerate into conflict and civil war and strife, but rather into an extremely orderly process of transition from totalitarian communism to liberal European social democracy, which is what we find in all of those countries who have now joined the European Union. So I think these are huge achievements. I do not deny that not everyone feels that this has brought them the kind of life that they want. We've just come through one of the most difficult economic situations of living memory, the financial crash in 2008, followed by the recession. We have had huge setbacks in many of our member states, and this has left its scars, as I think it probably has left some scars here. And we had a difficult crisis. I like to say that you had a better crisis than we did. You were better able to respond with the TARP, with the stimulus program. You were able to respond more quickly and more immediately because you were better equipped. We exposed the system, the crisis exposed some flaws in the structure of economic and monetary union, in the way in which the euro functioned. We had to repair that. We had to put in place mechanisms better to control the fiscal management of our individual member states. We had to put in place bailout mechanisms. We now have a European level bailout system. We had to put in place banking union, which we have done, but this took some time. And it's only in the last couple of years, frankly the last 3 to 4 years, that Europe has actually returned to positive growth. But we have returned to positive growth. And we are now experiencing between 1.5% and 2% growth a year in the EU. And we are seeing unemployment has come down, which is not to say that there are not still specific problems with unemployment, whether that's Greece or whether that's Spain in particular, where there's very high youth unemployment. I'm not saying that we don't have challenges, but actually I think we have turned the corner, and there is quite a lot of optimism about the economic future. But again, this is not necessarily fed into a sense of greater well-being in our population. And again, I think that's something you're perhaps not unfamiliar with here in the United States. So this is, while the economic news is actually quite positive out of Europe, and even as I talk to many people here in the United States, investment is high in Europe. People are optimistic about startup companies, high-tech companies investing. The future looks much brighter, but I do not deny that we still have many challenges, particularly in the area of structural reform, and we probably still have some challenges to work out with the countries who were part of the bailout programs, whether that's Greece, Spain in particular. So I think we still have some cleaning up of that process to do. I think we will do it, and I think our economic future actually looks much brighter. We face, of course, many other challenges. I'm not going to go into them all in detail now. I'm told you're a lively audience and that you like to ask lots of questions. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to do that. I'm not going to talk for excessive length. But apart from the economic challenge, which I think is common to all developed economies, by the way. I think all of our developed economies are facing the challenge of adapting to new technology, to changing global competitive situations, emerging markets, the changing nature of the business and supply chains. And nonetheless, I think we've all benefited hugely from trade. But equally, we in Europe live by trade. We invented trade, going back a long time. Trade is our lifeblood. But we're also having some problems selling the trade agenda and the globalization agenda to our population, because there is a growing sense in which some people feel they maybe have lost out in the way in which this has operated. I think actually, again, the counterfactual is that in fact trade has been to our huge benefit. We in Europe would not be able to survive without trade. We have an extensive trade agenda. We have negotiated just a very landmark deal with Canada. We have concluded recently with South Korea a couple of years ago. In fact, I negotiated that deal myself with Singapore, with Panama, with Colombia, with Central America, and we are negotiating actively with Mexico to upgrade our existing free trade agreement with Chile, with Japan, with the countries of Southeast Asia. We're negotiating with Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. We're negotiating an investment treaty, as you are, with China. We're negotiating with Mercosur in Latin America. And we already have extensive free trade arrangements with most of our immediate neighbors in North Africa, to the east, and in sub-Saharan Africa. So when we complete our trade agenda in the next 2 to 3 years, we will actually be at the hub of the largest free trading area the world has ever seen. We would very much like to complete that with a trade arrangement with the United States, which we are negotiating, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We've been negotiating that for the last 3 years, which is actually not a long time in trade terms. You've taken, I think, 6 years to complete the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We took 6 years to negotiate our deal with Canada. I like to claim I negotiated the fastest trade deal we've ever done with South Korea, which was 2.5 years. But I was very fortunate because I did it on the back of the deal that you had done with South Korea just a few months previously, and which you weren't able to ratify. So the Koreans we basically sort of copy and pasted a lot of the stuff that was in your agreement, and that helped us fast track our negotiation. And by the way, we ratified ours just before you finally ratified yours. So I think the Koreans were quite clever in playing both of us one against the other. So these trade deals do take time. We would love to complete this trade deal under this administration, if that's at all possible. We understand the difficulties of doing it without TPP being ratified, and the chances of TTP being ratified are highly debated here. We wait to see what can be done before the end of the year, whether in this Congress or in the lame duck Congress, as you call it, before the end of the year. We will do our best, but if we cannot make that breakthrough this year, I believe we will make it with the next administration, the end of next year or the beginning of the following year. We're very determined to achieve this breakthrough because we think there is much to be gained from a balanced and ambitious trade agreement between us. The Transatlantic Economic Corridor is still the most important economic corridor in the world, bar none. We are far more heavily invested in each other than either of us are invested anywhere else. There is far more transatlantic trade in services, in investment, in goods, in job creation. We create 15 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic through transatlantic investment, and this, dwarfs anything either of us do anywhere else in the world. American companies make more money out of their investments in the Netherlands or Belgium than they do out of their investments in China. And the profits out of U.S. investments in Europe are multiples of the profits you make from investing anywhere else in the world, and the same is true for us. And I have the opportunity to see that when I travel around the United States, the enormous benefits that you get from our investment, and I know well the huge benefits we in Europe get from American investment in our different member states. So we would like to complete this agenda. Again, the political context is difficult on both sides of the Atlantic. I promise not to talk about American election, but I just observe that neither candidate seems, or neither presumptive candidate seems excessively enthusiastic about trade deals. So we'll have to see how that plays out when the election is over and people actually enter into government. Equally on Europe, on the European side, while I think we have perhaps a slightly stronger consensus in favor of trade deals, there is still a lot of popular opposition, a lot of concern, a lot of worry about globalization, a lot of people feeling that in one way or another perhaps trade deals don't benefit them as much as they benefit an unspecified elite. I think you can demonstrate very clearly that's not the case, but we have to deal with the political realities that this is not always how people feel about these things. And so we're going to have to continue to work to defend the benefits of free trade and open trading systems, which are the only way ultimately to secure the prosperity that our economies need, and to have the kind of social justice programs which we need money to actually finance if we want to have a more equitable society. We, of course, face a number of other challenges, which I will just touch on. Happy to go into more detail in the question and answer session. We've just come through the refugee, or we're in the middle of dealing with a massive crisis of refugees. As you know, I think it's very important to make a distinction. People sometimes call this a migration crisis. It's not a crisis of migration. These are refugees. These are people who are driven out of their homes by conflict. They are not people who started out wanting to relocate to another country for a better economic future. They're people who left because of shelling, bombs, because of terrorism, because of being driven out of their homes, because of their ethnicity or their religion, and they've had to take shelter in neighboring countries. The bulk of the Syrian refugees are housed in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and we have to bear that in mind. Lebanon has shouldered the burden of nearly 1 million refugees with a population of 4 million people. Jordan, 1 in 7 people in Jordan are Syrian refugees, and Turkey, of course, has nearly 2.5 million Syrian refugees. So the countries in the front line for this are actually the neighboring countries, and we should not forget that. And they have done a lot to try to help these refugees. The international community has also done a lot. The European Union and its member states, we are the largest donor of humanitarian assistance to Syrian refugees and have been consistently since the beginning of this crisis, going back 5 years. Through the UN agencies and through the World Food Programme and the other excellent NGOs who work with the refugees in these countries. The US is also a major donor, but unfortunately there's a shortfall. The UN estimates that they only have funding for 40% of needs for the refugees in those 3 countries. So it's not surprising that a couple of years ago people decided they wanted to leave. They didn't see they had a future. Also, the prospects of peace and reconciliation and reconstruction in Syria seemed extremely poor. And so people voted with their feet and decided they would move now and try to build a better future for themselves somewhere else, and Europe was the obvious destination. And that led to the crisis of refugees, which we have seen. I make the distinction between refugees also because, of course, you'll be aware there's a legal distinction. That if you're a refugee and an asylum seeker under international law, to which we are fully subscribed in the European Union, people have rights. You cannot just turn them away when they knock at the door. You have to bring them in. You have to immediately provide them with assistance, with food, with medical care, with housing, while you process their application to decide whether indeed they meet the different criteria for asylum. This is rather different from the situation which you sometimes face, which is you try to take people who are already in other countries and you decide whether you will resettle them in the United States. And that gives you the luxury of looking closely at their files and deciding who you want to take, who you don't want to take, taking time to prepare their arrival. We have these people streaming across the border on a daily basis, and this has put a huge strain on our systems. If we were dealing with this on a continental level, the 2 or 3 million people whom we've had to deal with in the last 2 years or so would not be insurmountable. We're 508 million people in Europe. If we were dealing with it on a truly continental scale, then I think it would have been possible to manage this relatively easily. The reality is we don't manage it on a continental scale. We manage it mainly through individual countries. And when you look at that, the numbers come out slightly differently. Germany has welcomed 1.2 million refugees in the last 18 months or so. That would be equivalent to the United States taking nearly 5 million refugees. Greece has had to process 1 million refugees on its territory. That would be equivalent to the United States managing 32 million people crossing your border. So forgive me when people are somewhat critical of the way we've managed this in Europe and say, well, you haven't been as welcoming as maybe you could be. Ask yourselves how you would react if you had to face those kind of numbers. And I suspect that your system would also have come under massive strain. And I think people in Europe have shown enormous compassion, particularly in the frontline states, Italy, Greece, Germany, Sweden, Austria. I mean, there's a difficult political situation in Austria about refugees, but Austria has taken per capita more refugees than any country in Europe. And it is true that, unfortunately, many people have died crossing the Mediterranean, trying to reach Europe, and nearly 4,000 people when we at the last count. But it's also true that we've had search and rescue operations that have rescued nearly between 150 and 200,000 people. And that's a figure that doesn't get quoted very often. So I think we have really reached out and done all that we can. The individual countries have shown enormous compassion and humanitarian instincts, opening their homes, their schools, their town halls to try and look after people, to try and accommodate them. But the fact is the system is under strain, and that's why we've tried to act in different ways to deal with it. Firstly, trying to get better control of the external frontiers, trying not to close them, not to refuse access, but to try and make it more orderly and a more structured process. Secondly, to help those countries who find themselves in the front line, Italy, Greece, other countries, to say that we will relocate people from those countries to other parts of Europe to try and share the burden more equitably across 28 member states. This is very controversial. A number of our member states don't want to be part of that, and that's provoked another political debate. And of course, we've tried to stop the inflow. So we've been working, for example, with Turkey to try to reduce the movement of refugees from Turkey to Europe. And of course, we're working at the problem at the origin, trying to fix the situation in Syria, trying to fix the situation in Libya, so that we can actually create a situation in which people don't feel the need to come to Europe for a better life, but can actually try to build that in their own country. This is going to be with us for some time, this problem. There are 60 million displaced people in the world. And unfortunately, many of them are in the immediate neighborhood of Europe. So this is not a problem that's going to go away once we fix Syria or once we fix Libya. There are issues in sub-Saharan Africa. There are issues further east. Many of the people coming to us are actually Afghan, coming through Iran. We have Pakistanis, we have Bangladeshis. We have people coming from crisis situations in Africa, but also from failed states in Africa. So we're going to have to deal with this for a long time. So really, we have to, as Europeans, find a way better to manage all of this on a structured and systematic way so that we can stop this from always turning into a crisis every time there's a new wave of refugees, because this is not going to go away anytime soon. In this whole context, of course, we have the foreign policy challenges, which Frank touched on. I won't go into too much detail now, because otherwise I'm going to speak for too long. Of course, to the east, we have the situation with Russia and what has happened in Ukraine. I think this has really been a very dramatic development. I described earlier the development of the European Union, the development of peace and reconciliation on the European continent. I come from a generation that basically believed we were building a Europe in which war would be inconceivable and in which we would increasingly no longer rely on military force as a solution to our problems. And we did that even during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, with the Helsinki process, where we tried to put in place structures and systems which channeled our conflicts into conference rooms rather than into battlefields. And we all had a clear understanding that we would try not to use military force as a means of resolving our differences. Unfortunately, Mr. Putin has torn that rule book up with what he did in Ukraine. And that is really quite a dramatic shift. Now, we have to deal with it. We don't want a permanent confrontation with Russia. Russia is an important partner and ally on the continent. It is a major country on the European continent. It's a member of the Security Council. It's a nuclear power. It has the power to do good or evil elsewhere in the world, whether that's Syria, whether that's the deal with Iran. So we have to manage this slightly difficult situation of, on the one hand, pushing back very hard over what was done in Ukraine, and at the same time trying to continue to reach out and maintain a dialogue. I think what we did on the sanctions was absolutely the right reflex. We maintained European unity, transatlantic unity. I think this surprised Mr. Putin, the strength of the reaction. We have to maintain that until we have a satisfactory outcome to the situation in Ukraine through the Minsk process, and I believe we will do that. But beyond that, we have to try and reach some new understanding with Russia about how we are going to go forward, because we cannot accept to live under the threat of military force as being the sort of instrument of last resort if we don't agree, because this is the change which has come through the actions of Russia, and we have to deal with that new situation, including the consequences it has for military expenditure in Europe, for military preparedness. Again, I come from a generation that hoped we could spend less and less money on guns and missiles and weapons, and more on social welfare and education and research and all the good things in life that actually bring real benefits to our citizens. But we maybe have to make a slight adjustment to that in the light of the new circumstances. Of course, we have the situation in the Middle East and the wider Middle East. We have the battle against ISIL. We have basically a civil war between Sunni and Shia. We have the turmoil which followed the Arab Spring, or the Arab Awakening, as I'm told it's better to call it. And we have to deal with this huge instability in that region, which is not going to be easy to find a solution. I think we are very actively, Europe is very active in the anti-ISIL coalition, both our individual military member states on the military side, the European Union on the non-military side. I think we have to fight against radicalism and radicalization. This requires also working very closely with the Muslim community. We have, of course, the issue of terrorism. I'm not going to go into that in detail now, other than to say this is a major problem. But we've had terrorism before in Europe. We've had the IRA, we've had ETA, the Basque separatists, we've had the Baader-Meinhof, we've had the Red Brigades. I used to travel a lot to Bologna because I worked for President Prodi when he was president of the European Commission. You go to the railway station in Bologna, and there's a plaque commemorating the fact that 50 people died there when a right-wing terrorist group planted a bomb in 1980. So we are not unfamiliar with terrorism. And you have to fight it, but you also have to not fall into the trap that the terrorists set for you. The purpose of terrorism is to terrorize and to provoke a counter-reaction. They want two counter-reactions. They want alienation. So they want you to punish one section of society that you will deem to be responsible for harboring it, just as we had an anti-Irish backlash temporarily in the UK, very understandably, when Irish people were planting bombs in public houses and restaurants or in public parks in the UK. But actually the good people of the United Kingdom had the sense to realize this was not the way forward, and they didn't go down that road. We should not go down that road now by demonizing the Muslim community, which is exactly what ISIL wants us to do. This is not only wrong, unfair to that community, but it's also the wrong reflex. And the other thing they want is they want repression. They want more police, more use of police, more force, because that gives them leverage to say, you see, these people are against you, and you cannot, you will be discriminated against. So we have to be very careful in how we choose to react to these situations. And I believe that we in Europe will be resilient. We will be tough, but we will also be, I hope, sensitive to how to deal with these situations and not overreact in a way that is counterproductive and falls into the trap which the terrorists have set for us or would like to set for us. All of these situations, and this is my concluding remark, really for me show the importance of the transatlantic relationship. In none of these situations can either of us really act without the other. Now, there was once a time, perhaps, when US and EU agreement on anything was a sufficient condition to make it happen, to make a change in the world. That was true, perhaps, 20 or 30 years ago. It was certainly true, let us say, in the second half of the 20th century, when we were able to build the world liberal order that we can be very proud of, whether that was NATO, whether that was what we now call the WTO, or the GATT, the IFIs, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations. Very often, agreement between the Europeans and the US was sufficient to move the dial. Frankly, it is no longer a sufficient condition. The world has changed. There are many other actors who are asserting themselves, and legitimately, I understand that. China, India, Brazil, South Africa, they want their place in the sun. They feel that they also have something to contribute to the future shape of the world order, and they want their place at the table. I remain convinced that agreement between the United States and the EU remains a necessary condition for finding a solution to any of these problems. As we have shown in the case of the Iran deal, as we have shown in the case of sanctions against Russia, our common agenda and cooperation is absolutely indispensable if ever we are to find solutions. And we may not always. We agree on Syria, but we haven't yet been able to find the solution because we need others. But if we do not agree, then there certainly will be no solution. And I think that is what has to inspire us going forward through your election, through our discussions and debates in Europe on our future. And I think President Biden said very clearly at the Munich Security Council last year, we are each other's best friend of first resort. And I think this is absolutely clear to me, and I hope that will continue. Whatever political changes come here, whatever political changes come in Europe, and there will be political changes that we will have to adapt to, I hope that we will hold to this very important, great importance of the transatlantic relationship as a cornerstone of securing a better future for our respective countries, but also for the world at large. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, for an impressive, concise, and coherent presentation, overview, we thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. Yes, sir. The question is, what's the status of educational programs within the EU?
Education is absolutely central to everything we do. I've spent a certain amount of my career, I was responsible for contributing to the starting of the Erasmus program in Europe, which ensured that every graduate, every undergraduate would spend 1 year in another member state and get full credit for that time, which I think has created a whole new generation of Europeans who have learned to move across the countries of Europe, learn languages, have different cultural experiences. It's also helped improve the quality of that. I also helped set up the Tempest program, which was designed to produce education, third-level cooperation between Central and Eastern Europe after the collapse of the wall. And I also set up a program which only ran for a couple of years of higher education cooperation between the EU and the United States. That just to say that I think education is absolutely indispensable to everything we do. And I think one of the biggest challenges, I was talking with the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland this morning about the challenges of trade, and that the biggest problem being the changes in skills needs which that produces, that the jobs which disappear have one skill set, the jobs which are created have another skill set, and if you were in the old job, you don't necessarily have the skill set to take up the new jobs. And we have a paradox of high unemployment or people dropping out of the labor market at the same time as companies can't find the people they need for the new skills. So this is a huge challenge. What's the situation in Europe? Look, it's a mixed bag. I think we have basically a very good basic education system. I think what you call K-12, I think is pretty good. I think our university system is not so good anymore. It was, and there are certainly very, very good universities in Europe, but I think in general we need more investment and we're trying to reform our third-level education system. But we face also the same challenge as you do of what I call skills, which is not so much about education. I mean, you need the basic education, but it's about the skills, producing the right people with the right skills in the right place when they're needed, and equipping people, young people, to take up the jobs of the future rather than the jobs of yesterday, and helping people who've lost their jobs to retrain or to find new outlets or provide them with new skills, to offer them employment possibilities commensurate with the reality of the labor market and not with the labor market of yesterday. So, I mean, that's not really an answer to your question, but it's a huge issue. And I think on both sides of the Atlantic, education is absolutely key to our future prosperity and to building the kind of societies that we would like to have in the future to give us the same level of standard of living that we've had in the past.
Would you comment upon the problem of legitimacy?
Well, to be fair to the questioner, he was rather more specific than that. It was what are the issues of legitimacy in relation to the European project, which clearly is a construction which tries to marry democracy and accountability with a degree of intergovernmental decision-making. One of the complaints people on the street you will meet say, I can't elect the government in Brussels and I can't fire the government in Brussels the way I can do it in my national country. And this is true. But of course, my answer to that is, well, you could if we had a more federal system, but probably you will tell me you don't want a more federal system, that you want to retain a degree of autonomy at the level of your nation state. Therefore, you don't want to transfer, you don't want a government in Brussels. I mean, we could have a government, but we could decide to have a United States of Europe, but I don't think that's actually what people want. So we have the legitimacy and the democracy that we have wished for, which is we have a sort of bicameral system. We have the Council of Ministers, which is basically where people sit who are elected as members of national governments. So they are elected people. They are fully elected and legitimate, and they sit there and they speak on behalf of their country in the Council of Ministers, a little like the Senate. And we have the European Parliament, which is directly elected, who represent, if you like, the sort of globality of EU citizens without reference to countries. And you need the agreement of these two chambers to decide anything in Europe. So I argue that this is actually pretty legitimate and pretty democratic. Of course, it doesn't mimic or copy what you have at the national level, which is a government elected by the parliament or a president elected by popular suffrage. We could do that, but I'm not sure that's what our people want, because I think they want this halfway house. Now, this then does give rise to issues of legitimacy. I agree. But you fought a civil war over this, and I hope we've put our civil wars behind us. The balance between the state right and the federal right, the balance between what we decide at European level and what we decide at member state level, I think it pretty much is where our citizens feel comfortable with it. And some think it's already gone too far, and some possibly feel it hasn't gone far enough and they'd like a much more accountable system. Now, how do we deal with this going forward? I don't know. There is no final point of destination for the European Union. We haven't, I don't think we want to create a United States of Europe, frankly, in the sense that you have it. I think that we want to create a Europe in which we pool sovereignty in areas where we can demonstrate to our citizens that this delivers better outcomes than managing it at national level. If I take the issue of trade, it clearly makes more sense to negotiate as a bloc of 508 million consumers with our trading partners than it does to do that as 28 separate countries. When we're negotiating with the Americans, it's the two largest economies in the world trying to strike a trade deal. I can assure you, if I was Irish, I wouldn't want to be sitting across the table from my American interlocutor, because I know how that trade negotiation would work out on my own. So, I mean, there are clearly areas where it makes more sense to do things at European level. We get better outcomes. And that's what the debate is about. And that will be a continuous debate. And sometimes we will add things at European level, and then sometimes we'll subtract, because the political mood will be, no, we need to return those powers to member states because we don't want them at European level anymore. But you're absolutely right. The big problem we face in Europe, and I personally have felt this for the last 15 years, is a disconnect between what people do in Brussels and what people feel at national level. And if we have a problem of legitimacy and of people not having enough trust in the system, it is mainly because national politicians, for as long as I can remember, come to Brussels, strike deals, congratulate each other behind closed doors, then go home, and when they get off the plane, they say, I've just come from Brussels. You're not going to believe what those people wanted to do to you. But let me tell you, you were so lucky I was there, because I stopped them. And if by any chance what they're bringing back is good news, they will get off the plane and they will say, you're not going to believe what those people in Brussels would have done if I hadn't been, but I've succeeded in making them doing this, and it's fantastic. Now, I understand that, frankly. I'm a bureaucrat. I don't have to stand for election. So I have enormous respect for politicians who have to get up every electoral cycle and actually get themselves reelected. So please, I'm not belittling politicians. But The problem with this technique is it has trained people in Europe to understand bad comes from Brussels, good comes from my national politicians. And then you turn around at some point and you say, would you like to take a vote on whether you give more powers to Brussels or whether you continue to have a system where these things get decided in Brussels? Is it surprising that many people say, well, actually, I'm not so sure, because what have you been telling me for the last 10 years? So I think this is part of our problem. We haven't had a sufficiently honest dialogue with our citizens about why it makes more sense for certain things to get decided in Brussels, even if that comes at some cost to exactly what we would like as individual countries. So we have to compromise. You have to accept something that is not exactly what you would have wanted, but it gives you ultimately a better outcome. And why sometimes you have to accept things that you absolutely don't like because others have accepted things that they don't like so you can get what you want. That's basically how we build the politics of compromise in any democracy. And I think we just need to have a more honest debate with our citizens about how all this works, why it works to their benefit, and why there are democratic checks and balances in everything that we do. It is not decided by unelected bureaucrats like myself. It is decided by elected politicians, either elected nationally, speaking in Brussels with a mandate from their national parliament, or directly elected by the European Parliament. So at core, it is a democratic system, but it doesn't look the same way as a national system. Sorry, that's a long answer, but I think it's actually a very important question.
On questions like nations disagreeing on whether to have nuclear energy or not, how do you reconcile that?
Well, this is a very good example to me of why some things you decide at European level and sometimes you decide at national level. By the way, you have the same thing here. Your principle is a pluribus unum, right? So your objective was to, from great diversity, to try and build a common identity. Our problem is unity in diversity. People are very attached to their nation state and to the ability of that nation state to shape the environment in which they live. And in wanting to do things together, we must only harmonize or do in common what's indispensable to do in common. It is not indispensable to have a common position on whether you like to use nuclear energy to produce your energy or whether you like to use other means, whether you want to use renewables or whether you want to use other forms of energy. So the energy mix, the choice of the source of your energy, we leave to individual countries. We do not wish to have a common European policy on this. We don't think it's necessary, and it would not be probably politically acceptable, because you could not say in countries who don't want nuclear energy, there are countries like Austria, for example, who have been against nuclear energy from the very beginning. Ireland also has had strong resistance, never gone down the nuclear road. If you tried to impose on Ireland a nuclear plant, I can assure you there would be a revolution. So this is not something we need to decide at European level. What we decide at European level is the interconnectivity of energy systems, is the interoperability of systems, and is, with Energy Union, the attempt to make sure that no member state is dependent on one exclusive source for its energy, and you know what I'm talking about, to make sure that all member states have at least 3 different sources of energy. So we're trying to create a genuine single market for energy with interconnectors, with all the software that goes with that in terms of pricing, transfer pricing, and agreements on the sharing of energy. But at the end of the day, how you produce the energy in any given territory is a matter for that country to decide. And I think this is perfectly feasible. I don't think we have to have a common European rule about whether you want to use nuclear energy or not. If people want to use it, they're perfectly free to do so. If they choose for all kinds of reasons not to go down that road, they don't have to do so. And that doesn't change, in my view, doesn't alter the fundamental objectives of a common energy market and a security of supply, which means that we are not dependent on one particular source for our energy going forward.
Would you comment upon the discomfort of Eastern European states, and specifically with respect to energy plans and development?
Well, and the question refers more specifically to the project to expand the Nord Stream pipeline from Russia into Germany with what's called Nord Stream 2. I have to answer you in two parts. I mean, one is a technical answer, the other is a political answer. The technical answer is this is a commercial project. I mean, this has been launched by a number of European companies in conjunction with Gazprom. It is not a political decision to do it. These are companies who have decided they want to do it. There are serious questions about the commercial viability. Nord Stream 1, I think, is only used to about 60% at the present time. So do we really need an even bigger version of it? There are other issues which will have to be examined very closely by the European Commission. There are competition issues. Will it respect fully the competition principles of the third energy package in terms of unbundling, of linkage between ownership of the infrastructure and selling of the product? Will it meet environmental standards? There are some very serious questions about the impact on the seabed and various other questions. All of these technical issues are going to have to be studied very carefully. And so Nord Stream 2 has not yet got a green light on any of these issues, and they will have to be studied, and we'll see what comes out. On the politics of it, I think many people have been very clear that they don't feel that it's consistent to develop this additional means of transporting energy from Russia into Europe. That there are other, when we want to diversify the sources. But that's a political discussion. The energy union is in fact doing all of the other diversification. Nord Stream 2 is not part of the energy union. It has no public money in it. It has no public support. The projects into which we are putting money are aimed at ensuring that the countries, particularly of Central and Eastern Europe, do not have excessive dependence on Russian supply and have at least two alternative sources. We also believe that Ukraine should continue to be a transit country, and we do not wish to see that cut out of the Ukrainian economy. So how all of this plays out over the next few years, we will see. But I emphasize on the technical side, the Nord Stream 2 has neither been approved as being in conformity with all the various boxes which will have to be ticked, and neither, frankly, there are doubts about the commercial viability, and I think there are those who question whether, at the end of the day, this project will ever see the light of day, given some of the question marks which are there. On the politics of it, we understand that people would prefer other alternatives, and we are busy working on those alternatives independently of what happens to Nord Stream 2.
The question deals with the prospect of of terrorism metastasizing and spreading slowly and becoming worse. And if that's an image of the phenomenon that we face, and if that's correct, what can we do about it?
I think what happened in Orlando was absolutely horrific. And I can only imagine what those people went through and what people have gone through in Brussels during the attacks, in Paris during the two attacks, in San Bernardino. But let's be clear, in these cases, these were actually Americans and these were Europeans who were doing this to ourselves. So let's not rush in the first instance to blame people in the Middle East. And by the way, horrible though those events are and horrible though the loss of life is, every day you open your newspaper and you will see a terrorist attack in Lebanon, you will see it in Karachi, you'll see it in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria. There are far more Muslims dying daily because of terrorism than there are people in the West. So let's put this in a sense of perspective. It is something we should be concerned about. We have to do everything we can to keep our people safe. And that includes improved intelligence sharing and reinforcing our law enforcement capabilities, doing whatever is needed to try and make us live in a more safe environment. But we should not forget that the problem that you refer to is damaging the people of the Middle East far more than it's damaging us on a daily basis. And we have to try and find a solution to that problem, and we have to work with the countries of the Middle East to try and find a solution, because we will not impose a solution, neither the US nor the EU nor any of us. We will not impose a solution in the Middle East. We have to work with those countries, work with the people of goodwill who want a more peaceful and a more stable Middle East against those such as ISIL or the extremists who want to create chaos. because their agenda is to create chaos. And it is, as I said earlier, and I really believe this, and I know it from my Irish experience, the terrorists want to create hatred and they want to create division, because when they've done that, they've won. Then it becomes self-fulfilling. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we become the recruiting sergeants for them. So I think we constantly have to remind ourselves about the facts of the situation, the reality of what we're dealing with. And it is horrible, but the fact is, either in Europe or in the United States, you're at far greater risk from other forms of violence than you are from terrorism on a daily basis. So we need to put this in a perspective. That's not to say that we don't need to do everything we can to try to deal with the issue of ISIL or Al-Qaeda, violent extremism, radicalization. Why is it that our young people, including in America, are persuaded to go and join ISIS or Al-Qaeda and fight in Syria? Why are young women brought up in our societies willing to go and become the wives of terrorists to produce babies? How is this working? What's at work here that this is happening? And these are the questions we need to ask ourselves. So I don't honestly think that this is some kind of giant global confrontation. I don't believe in Samuel S. Huntington's clash of civilizations. But I do believe that the clash is with a certain vision of the future, which is that of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, a destructive, negative vision, and that we have to push back against constantly.
I guess you're being asked to comment on whether there was not equal treatment between Serbia and Kosovo. And Serbia was not treated as well as Kosovo was in the crisis of that time. If you'd care to comment.
Well, I mean, I think something in there about visas, I'm not entirely sure. But look, the Western Balkans is a hugely complex problem. We, together with the United States, are doing everything we can to help the Western Balkan countries make the transition from the former Yugoslavia and from the civil war and the violence and the horrors of Srebrenica and everything else that went on in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of Yugoslavia into modern, democratic, rule of law-based countries who can join the European Union. And we've made it very clear that we will welcome it. They are the only countries who have been given such a clear perspective of European Union membership on condition that we can sort out their issues between them. Because we're not going to import into the European Union unresolved issues between the different countries of Western Balkans. So all our work goes into that, specifically on Kosovo. My former boss, Cathy Ashton, High Representative and Vice President, European Foreign Minister, spent hours and hours and hours in negotiations with the two sides, trying to find a solution. And we have made huge progress, huge progress. But it's an intractable problem. It's a very difficult problem, but we are making incremental progress, and we will continue to accompany that process. We treat both sides equally. We understand the concerns of both sides, and we understand some of the history that is there. But we will work tirelessly to find solutions to all the problems outstanding in the Western Balkans to help those countries become modern, rule of law, liberal economy-based democracies and enter into the European Union. And we would like to do this if they can all join at the same time, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, we will have to take those who are more advanced in the process than others. But in all cases, we will expect outstanding political problems between them to have been resolved. And we are trying to do that in the most equitable way possible. That's all I can say about Serbia and Kosovo, but also about the Western Balkans in general.